Right, time for another video. And today, I'll do an assessment of the slave trade. Worth noting, I'm gonna switch away from my assessments of presidents for a bit and specific periods, and go back to just more random stuff that I tend to do. Anyways, so when we often think of the slave trade, especially as the United States, usually your first thought goes to the transatlantic one. You know, the triangle trade, where you have trade going from Africa to the Americas to Europe, and then Europe to Africa. This is how we usually think of it. This is because, as the United States, and some other countries to a lesser extent, these are the ones that really impact us, the ships that went on this trade route. But it's worth noting, slavery has been around for far longer and has been far more extensive than just the triangular trade. For one, even in the United States, although we often think of ourselves as the big ones who did a lot of slavery, and don't get me wrong, we did a lot of it. I don't think you get to, I believe we had 3 to 6 million slaves in the US. I forgot the exact number during the Civil War. Despite having that, we weren't even the biggest importers of slaves. That would be Brazil. In fact, they only abolished slavery in the 1880s. So you have, of course, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States being the real big importers in this case. But what about other times? What other slave trades went on? Well, for one, there was the Barbary States. These were a group of states in what is now called the Maghreb, so think North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Libya. Those states were full of piracy. And what they would do is they would go to Europeans and take their ships, sell the people that they capture as slaves, and anything on the ship just flat out to make a profit. They even did raids all the way up to Iceland. They went all the way up to Iceland, at least once. In fact, it became so annoying that bigger states, like for example the UK, Spain, France, they would just pay off the Barbary states to leave them alone, and they'd raid all the other little guys. And that was a big one as well, especially because the United States, well, the result of the US discovering what the Barbary states were doing, and by discovering I mean they got their people seized, was to go over and start blowing things up, as is US tradition. Needless to say, the Barbary states went to an interesting place, especially because the results of the Barbary Wars and Europe's later intervention into the area was that Spain and France started establishing their footholds in what is now northern Africa. So when you look at a map of, for example, the Scramble for Africa, you'll notice that France has Algeria. France took Algeria in the 1800s after the Barbary Wars as their way of ending the slave trade there. And in fact, Algeria, interestingly enough, was actually integrated into France proper. So it wasn't seen as a colony like, say, Mali was. It was considered an actual part of France. And the big reason they took it over and did the integration was because, well, one, it was close, and two, the slave trade, and specifically abolishing it. They took the threat from that area really seriously, and because of how close it was, they allowed it to integrate into the metropole. So that was one big one, but there are more. For one, as already established, Africa, specifically the area called Guinea, was full of slaving empires. The Ashanti, Benin, heck, the Mali Empire, which we associate with Mansa Musa, and those, they were a big kingdom that was profiting off of slavery. Now, it wasn't only slavery. They had salt, gold, slaves. That was their main exports. But slaves was definitely one of them. In fact, Guinea was rather known for having a lot of slaves, so that when Portugal showed up and said, hey, do you mind if we trade slaves here? They were like, sure, how many do you want? The people of Guinea were happy to do business, and as a matter of fact, this triangular trade that Portugal later developed with its colonies in Africa, those outposts, was what allowed slavery to become so cheap that, for example, you would have millions sailing across the Americas to Brazil and the US and Cuba and sustain massive plantation economies. And then, of course, there is the Swahili trade. For those who don't know, when you think of the Swahili, think of Tanzania, specifically the coast. Tanzania and Kenya are what were known as the Swahili coast at the time. The Swahili were a group of people mixed with Arabs and Africans, and they moved to the coast and established their own little slaver kingdoms. Well, eventually it all got taken over by Oman, but even before then, they had a massive trade in the Indian Ocean, selling slaves from Africa to India and all over the place, as well as to the Arab world. In fact, the Swahili only exists as a people really because of those initial expeditions for slaves and the constant interaction between the Arabs and the African tribes in the region. Ethiopia also had a notable trade, though to a lesser extent than the Swahili. Then again, what do you expect? They were kind of surrounded by a bunch of people who hated them. Who exactly was willing to sell to them or buy from them? And overall, while generally we can observe it all over the place, for example, Rome, if we go all the way back to them, due to their massive dependence on slavery for their economy, quite literally relied on it. And so naturally slavery was a big thing there. Carthage was the same, the Hellenic cities. When you think of the classical world, like when you think of antiquity, slavery should be there. Because while it's not the same as chattel slavery that we think of, it was absolutely massive. Like 40% of the population in some places could be slaves. And that would be honestly expected. In fact, part of the reason Rome collapsed was because of slavery. And you see slaves throughout history. In Mesoamerica, you see it too. Frankly, you see it everywhere. And indeed, indentured servitude was another big thing, especially for the places like, say, China, where because they didn't have much slavery themselves, in the traditional sense, they would instead have indentured servants. Where if you got into debt, you could literally sell yourself as a servant and basically give away your personhood until you paid off your debts and then you were back out. It was actually quite the common practice for a lot of countries. But then, was the slave trade beneficial? I ask sarcastically, in part because no, it wasn't. That should be obvious, but let's ignore morality for a second. I know it's slavery, but let's say that morality isn't a factor. So was this beneficial slave trade that a lot of people engaged in truly that beneficial? Well, let's run through the basics. Does slavery contribute positively to an economy? No. One may disagree, and they're welcome to, but fundamentally, a slave is inferior to a freeman. A free laborer is better than a slave in terms of all practical applications. Why? Well, a free man can contribute through wages and other things to the economy, so they ought to be each there. A slave can't do that because, they're a slave. They don't own themselves and they don't get paid a wage. They may be gifted money, but they're not paid a wage. And so that's one benefit. Another is incentives. A free man has a lot more incentives to work hard than a slave. Even serfs do, which is why you see feudal Europe switching to a lot of serfs and peasants rather than relying on slaves. And we also see from those serfs and peasants that it swapped to a free economy, relying on free men and not feudal structures, is more profitable for everyone and more productive. And so, fundamentally, was it a good thing? No. However, it did make some people rich. Dahome's leader absolutely got rich off the slave trade, as did Ashanti's, and so did the many others who thought it was a good idea to trade in slaves. In fact, in the Swahili coast, it was considered so good for the people controlling Zanzibar that when the British showed up and said, hey, you're going to abolish slavery here, the person leading Zanzibar said no. Fun fact, that led to the shortest war in history. It lasted minutes. In fact, the British actually were a big draw for why the slave trade ended, including in Brazil, where they harassed Brazilian ships until they stopped trading in slaves, and eventually harassed them some more until they abolished slavery. Took them till the 1880s, though, but still, it got abolished. In fact, the slave trade was such a big justification for a lot of things that what we see is countries like France, the UK, and Belgium would do is they would go in and say, we're going to take lands in Africa. Why? To abolish slavery. Now, Belgium, if you know your history here, is a bit laughable with that claim, considering the whole Free State of the Congo. But as a matter of fact, one, that was their king, and two, it was such a pure disaster that the king should have had to have it taken from him, because everyone around the Belgians was looking at him like a freaking insane person for how brutal he was being in the Congo. But yeah, France and Britain, along with the Germans eventually, once they started getting into colonial game, were absolutely using the end of slavery to justify their imperial actions. And did they commit to it? Actually, yeah. The UK in particular made a regular habit of basically raiding any slave ships that sailed on the coast of Africa until eventually slavery was severely lowered. I won't say it was completely eradicated because there's no way to do it, especially with a continent that large. But the British dang sure gave it their best attempt to do so. The French helped, so did the Germans, and the Belgians to a lesser extent. They all heavily cracked down on slavery because, well, what better justification is there to invade a place? If you can frame it as freeing people, there's a lot more people willing to go along with you. Plus, all those former slaves can be used basically as free allies. Because, hey, if someone wants to revolt, but everyone else is a former slave that just got freed by you, that person isn't likely to step out of line and start trying to take over the territory or kick you out of it. And so the end of slavery was a big justification for European imperialism, because they could go and say, yeah, we're going to abolish slavery here, and once they go and do it, they can say, yes, clearly that earns me the rights to control this place in perpetuity. I mean, if it works, but I'm sure some people would disagree with the justification. And in fact, as we see throughout history, whether it be early antiquity with Rome, the Middle Ages with the Swahili on the Swahili coast, the early modern period with Barbary states in Guinea, and eventually the Victorian era with the last stragglers, including, among others, Ethiopia, the Saudis, actually most of Arabia if we're being honest, and the few kingdoms that had yet to be conquered by Europe. Slavery was pretty dogged in its persistence, but pretty hard to actually benefit from if you're anyone except a slave owner. If you weren't a slave owner, generally speaking, slavery was not a good thing for you. And so economically, it was severely damaging, and we see after the abolishment of the practice, a lot of benefits. Especially in the US, where shortly after the abolition of slavery, the economy started growing rapidly. We can discuss the Gilded Age later. In fact, I would love to do that and explain what I would look at it as. But the United States, even with Jim Crow and a lot of other things that attempted to basically make it harder to actually, do what they were planning on and free the slaves and free the people, even with the restraints placed on its own people, the U.S. prospered massively from the end of slavery, and so did African Americans, even if to a lesser extent. And so the slave trade is just a bad thing. It is flatly wrong. But that leads us to the modern day. Shortly after decolonization, slavery started sprouting up again because, well, let's face it, post-colonial societies are not exactly stable, especially when people disagree on who should be in charge. So what ended up happening is a lot of slavery basically started up again because people looked around and said, well, if I can do what I want and I want money, I'm just going to take my neighbors, sell them, and then make a profit. And so we see the modern slave trade, now called human trafficking, grow to a massive degree to the point where there are more slaves now than there are in the past. Think about that. This period of time, right here, the amount of slaves then is less than the number of slaves now. That is insane to think about. And so I've come to the conclusion in my general assessment that not only is this a bad thing, but it would be a good thing to send the military to places to help abolish it. Now, one may want to use the UN. I wouldn't think they'd be very good at it, honestly. I'd prefer using US troops. But fundamentally, if we believe and understand properly that slavery is bad, you maybe do it for moral reasons, I'll do it for economic and practical ones. But if we believe that slavery is bad, then we should abolish it everywhere we can and seek to, as best as we can, minimize human trafficking and slavery. Well, those are one and the same, but still, point made. And so, action should be taken. Now, I am definitely on the more aggressive side with military intervention. But if it is a moral evil, we should act against it. And as people have died to make men holy, why not die to make men free? It just seems like a practical thing to do. Plus, if all else fails, at least you'll get to say that you died for something that was worthwhile. Or supported something that was worthwhile. Even support has some value. That'll be all. Thank you very much.